He pointed at her name on the assignment board, laughed loud enough for the entire room to hear, and said, "Not my problem. Send someone else." The room erupted. She said nothing. She just looked at him, steady, quiet, unflinching, and walked away. That was Tuesday. By Friday, those same men were pinned down, bleeding and begging for someone who could see through the mountain. They got her, and she erased 26 targets before anyone could apologize. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. There is a particular kind of cruelty that wears the face of indifference. It does not announce itself loudly. It does not leave bruises or draw blood. It simply turns away. It shrugs. It assigns someone to the corner of the room and then forgets they exist. And after long enough, even the people watching start to believe the corner is exactly where that person belongs. That was the cruelty that defined Sergeant Claire Whitmore's daily existence at Fort Raven Ridge. Fort Raven Ridge sat high in the Colorado mountains, carved into terrain so unforgiving that even the wind seemed to have an attitude. It was a remote Army training outpost, the kind of place where soldiers went to get tougher, where the altitude punished weakness, and where the unofficial hierarchy of respect was established not by rank alone, but by how loudly you could command a room. The mountains didn't care about your feelings, neither did the culture. Claire had been stationed there for 7 months. 7 months of early mornings, 7 months of equipment checks, communications reports, and routine support tasks completed without complaint, without error, without drama. 7 months of being invisible. She was 30 years old, brown hair pulled back tight, eyes that never wasted motion. They moved deliberately, read everything, and gave away nothing. She was not small, she was not fragile. She simply occupied space the way a blade rests in its sheath, completely still, completely contained, completely ready, in a way that has nothing to do with show. Most people at Fort Raven Ridge had formed their opinion of Claire Whitmore within the first 48 hours of meeting her. Quiet, reserved, probably fine at desk work, competent enough, nothing special. Staff Sergeant Dennis Cole had said it best during her first week, leaning against the wall of the equipment bay with a cup of coffee and a grin that suggested he thought he was being generous. "She seems like a good support soldier, the kind you want handling paperwork and radio checks. Keep her back at base and she'll do just fine." Nobody argued, nobody pushed back, because that was the comfortable version of Claire Whitmore, and comfortable versions of people require no further examination. The problem with comfortable versions is that they are almost never true. Claire's classified service record, the full version, the one that required specific clearance to even open, told a story so different from the Fort Raven Ridge consensus that it might as well have described a different person. But almost nobody at the base had read it. Her precision shooting scores from advanced marksmanship training were not just high. They were the kind of scores that instructors kept on file to show new recruits what the standard actually looked like when someone took it seriously. She had tested at ranges that most soldiers never attempted in live qualification. She had trained in conditions, weather, elevation, visibility that would have sent the average trained shooter back to the basics. Before Fort Raven Ridge, she had spent several years operating as a long-range reconnaissance specialist. The kind of work that didn't get talked about at dinners or mentioned in casual conversation. The kind of work where being invisible was not a personal flaw. It was a professional requirement. You moved through environments without being detected. You observed without being observed. You gathered intelligence that saved lives you would never personally meet. And then you filed your report and moved on to the next assignment. She had completed deployments in terrain that made the Colorado mountains look approachable. She had operated alone under pressure in silence with no backup and no margin for error. She had never failed a mission. But nobody at Fort Raven Ridge knew any of that, and Claire had not told them. This was the thing about her that people misread most consistently. They saw her silence and concluded she had nothing to say. They saw her patience and decided it was passivity. They saw the absence of self-promotion and assumed there was nothing to promote. What they never considered was that she had made a choice. A deliberate, reasoned, completely intentional choice to let the situation reveal itself. She had learned something during those years of reconnaissance work that most people never figure out, even after a lifetime of competing for attention. The loudest voice in the room is almost never the most accurate one, and the truth when it matters, when it really genuinely matters, does not need to be announced. It arrives like a result, like a consequence, like the ground beneath your feet when you finally stop pretending it isn't there. Claire believed this the way some people believe in gravity, quietly, absolutely, without the need to explain it to anyone. So she completed her work. She checked her equipment. She filed her reports. She arrived before anyone else, and she stayed after most people had gone. She did the invisible work that keeps an outpost functioning, the kind of work that everyone takes for granted until the day it stops getting done, and she did it without expecting a single word of recognition. And most days she got exactly what she expected. The person who broke through the indifference, not because he was loud, but because he was paying attention, was Sergeant Ethan Brooks. Ethan was an intelligence analyst, which meant his entire professional purpose was to look at things carefully and understand what he was actually seeing rather than what he expected to see. He was 34, methodical, and had developed a habit over years of analytical work that made him unusual in a military environment. He was genuinely, consistently curious about the people around him. He had noticed Claire during his second week at Fort Raven Ridge. Not in a dramatic moment, not in some cinematic instant where the light caught her at the right angle and revealed her hidden depths. He noticed her because she was studying a terrain map, not glancing at one, not flipping through one because it happened to be on the table, actually studying it the way you study a problem you intend to solve. She was tracing elevation lines with one finger while her eyes moved across the grid coordinates, and something in the focus of that gesture caught his analytical attention and refused to let go. He filed it away, watched for other moments. He noticed how she handled equipment maintenance. There was a specific confidence in the way she worked, not the showy confidence of someone trying to prove something, but the quiet confidence of someone who has used these tools in real conditions and knows exactly what they can and cannot do. Her hands moved without hesitation, without the small pauses that indicate uncertainty. He noticed how she watched other soldiers move through space, not with judgment, but with the assessment of someone automatically calculating angles, distances, and positions. It was the kind of involuntary habit you develop when your survival has depended at some point on getting those calculations right. He noticed the small notebook she kept always in the same left breast pocket, and the way she occasionally pulled it out to write something down after observing a situation not before. Each observation by itself meant nothing particular. Together they told a story. Ethan had been in intelligence long enough to know that what people don't say is often more important than what they do say. And what Claire Whitmore wasn't saying at the top of her voice with her entire body and history was something significant. One evening, about 6 weeks into his time at Fort Raven Ridge, Ethan found himself near the equipment bay just as Claire was finishing up her end-of-day checks. The rest of the unit had moved toward the mess hall. The bay was quiet. He sat down on a bench near the door and said without particular preamble, "You're a lot more than what they think you are." Claire didn't stop working. She turned a connector fitting with practiced ease and said, "What makes you say that?" "Because I've been watching how you watch things," he said. "And someone watches the way you do for specific reasons, experience being one of them." She set down the fitting and looked at him. The look was neither warm nor cold. It was evaluating. The same look he realized that she gave terrain and equipment honest assessment without performance. "Most people don't notice that," she said. "I'm paid to notice things other people miss," he replied. A small silence. Then she said, "Good, because someone should be." He waited, and when she didn't add anything, he asked the question that had been forming in his mind for weeks. "Why do you let them underestimate you? You could set the record straight." Your record alone would change the conversation. Claire picked up the next piece of equipment, turned it in her hands, checked the calibration. The motion was perfectly unhurried, like she had all the time in the world because she had already decided exactly how this conversation would end. "Because the moment will come when they need to know," she said. "And that moment will mean something. Walking into a briefing room and correcting people's assumptions, that doesn't mean anything. It just starts an argument. But when the situation demands the truth arrives with weight. People feel it differently. They remember it differently." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "You've thought about this a lot," he said. "I've had a lot of time to think," she said simply. "People don't talk to me much. There was something in the way she said it that was not bitterness. It was more like an observation, accurate and unremarkable. Water is wet. The altitude here is high. People don't talk to me much. Ethan felt something shift in his perception. Not surprise exactly, more like the satisfaction of a picture finally coming into focus. Well, he said, standing up, when that moment comes, I'd like to be the one beside you. Claire looked at him again, the same honest assessment. I know, she said. That's why I'm talking to you. The briefing happened 4 days later. High-risk mountain escort mission. Critical supply convoy. Black Canyon passed the most demanding terrain in the region, with elevation changes, blind corners, and limited radio communication that made it a logistical nightmare even under perfect conditions. Captain Mason Reed stood at the front of the room the way he always did, ownership in every posture, voice carrying the settled confidence of a man who had never seriously considered that he might be wrong about something important. Reed was experienced. That part was real. He had led successful missions. He had made decisions under pressure that turned out to be correct. He was not a fool in the broad sense of the word, but he had a specific pointed blindness when it came to certain people. And that blindness had been reinforced over time by an environment that never challenged it. He ran through the assignments, vehicles, drivers, security positions, tactical communication. Everything laid out with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times. Then, the Overwatch position. Overwatch, the elevated long-range observer, who serves as the eyes of the entire operation. The person who sees what the soldiers on the ground cannot see. The person who in difficult terrain, like Black Canyon Pass, is the difference between a mission that succeeds and soldiers who never come home. It was the most important assignment on the board. Someone accounts differ on who exactly spoke first, but the name surfaced from somewhere in the room, suggested Sergeant Claire Whitmore. The reasoning was actually sound. Her communications background meant she understood the radio protocols. Her record, the parts of it that were visible in the basic personnel file, showed precision and reliability. And anyone who had actually watched her the way Ethan had watched her would have found the suggestion obvious. Captain Reed looked up from the assignment board. He found Claire in the room. He looked at her for a moment, the kind of look that has already made up its mind before it starts. And then he laughed, not a small laugh, not an uncomfortable, dismissive sound that could be interpreted charitably as stress or distraction. A real laugh, loud enough to fill the room, pointed enough to land exactly where it was aimed. Whitmore, he said, for Overwatch. He shook his head, still grinning, like someone who had just been told an excellent joke. Not my problem. Send someone else. The room followed his lead. Of course it did. That is what rooms do when the person in authority sets the tone. They match it. They amplify it. They turn a single dismissal into a consensus, and the consensus into a fact, and the fact into something that feels from inside that room like simple common sense. Laughter. Sideways glances. Someone near the back muttered something that got a chuckle from the men beside him, and Claire Whitmore sat still through all of it. This was the moment that most people would have broken, not into pieces, but into performance, into the kind of anger that defends itself, or the kind of hurt that makes itself visible, or the kind of pride that forces a confrontation because silence feels like surrender. Claire did none of those things. She sat with her spine straight and her hands still and her face carrying the same expression it always carried, calm, attentive, completely present. She looked at Captain Reed, not with hatred, not with the burning theatrical contempt the moment seemed to deserve. She looked at him with something closer to clarity. She memorized his face in that moment, not to hold against him, but because she understood with a certainty that came from somewhere much deeper than emotion that this moment was going to matter later. That she was going to need to remember exactly what it looked like when someone made this particular kind of mistake. She memorized it, and then she stood up quietly and walked out of the room. Nobody called after her. Nobody stopped laughing quickly enough to notice that she left. Ethan Brooks was the only person in that room watching her go, and the expression on his face was not the same as everyone else's. It was something quieter and more complicated, the look of someone watching a clock they know is already counting down, waiting for the moment the alarm goes off. Outside the briefing room in the corridor that led back to the communications section, Claire stopped walking. She stood still for exactly 3 seconds. Then she exhaled slow, controlled, the kind of breath that acknowledges the weight of something without being crushed by it, and she kept moving. Private First Class Jamie Ortega was coming the other way down the corridor. He was 22, newer than almost anyone else at the base, and he had not yet learned how to arrange his face into the neutral expressions that more experienced soldiers wore like armor. He had heard the laughter through the briefing room door, and now he was looking at Claire with something open and uncomfortable on his young face. Guilt, maybe? Or the particular distress of witnessing something wrong and not having acted. "Sergeant Whitmore," he said, stopping. "Ortega," she said, not breaking stride. He stopped searching for a word. That wasn't right. She slowed just enough to look at him. And the expression she gave him was not the devastated expression of someone who needed his validation. And it was not the hard expression of someone pretending not to be hurt. It was something genuinely different from both of those things. "No," she said, "it wasn't. A beat. But it doesn't change my job today," she added, "or tomorrow." She kept walking. Ortega stood in the corridor for a moment, watching her go with the look of someone who had just learned something he hadn't been expecting to learn and wasn't entirely sure what to do with it yet. Ethan found her 20 minutes later in the communications section, running a calibration check on a long-range radio unit with the same focused unhurriedness she brought to every technical task. He sat down across from her without asking. "I'm sorry," he said. "You didn't laugh," she said, not looking up. "No, but I also didn't say anything." A pause. Hands kept moving steady on the equipment. "Ethan," she said finally, "have you ever been in a situation where speaking up would have changed the moment, but not the outcome? Where the only real answer isn't the argument, it's the result?" He thought about it, really thought about it, which was something she appreciated about him. "Yeah," he said, "I have." "That's where I am," she said. "I've been where I am for a long time, and I'm not leaving because Mason Reed thinks I'm a joke." She set down the calibration tool and looked at him with those steady eyes. "I'm staying because when this outpost needs what I actually know how to do, I intend to be here." Ethan nodded slowly. "The Overwatch position," he said. "They gave it to Carver. Specialist David Carver, 26 years old, good soldier on a flat range, steady under normal conditions, had never worked at elevation with hostile contact, had never, as far as Ethan's records showed, operated in a live Overwatch role during active fire." "I know," Claire said. "He's not ready for that terrain," Ethan said. "I know that too," Claire said. A silence between them that held more than either of them said. "If something goes wrong," Ethan started, "then we handle it," Claire said quietly. "Whatever it takes." She went back to her calibration check. Ethan watched her for a moment, the stillness of her, the controlled precision of every movement, and thought again about the clock counting down. And somewhere in the back of his analytical mind, he was already preparing for the alarm. That night, the base carried the particular restlessness that precedes a major operation. Soldiers move through routines with the heightened awareness of people who know that tomorrow will matter. Conversations were sharper, laughter shorter. The quiet between words loaded with everything nobody said out loud. In the communications section, Claire was still working, not because she had to be, because this was how she managed the weight of what was coming. Not with conversation, not with distraction, with preparation, with the slow, thorough ritual of knowing that every piece of equipment in her section was functioning perfectly, because that was the one thing she could absolutely control, and she was not willing to leave anything to chance. She had been this way since the very beginning of her career. Her first instructor in long-range reconnaissance training, a weathered sergeant major named Delacroix, who communicated mostly in direct statements and the occasional raised eyebrow, had told her something during her third week that she had never forgotten. "Whitmore," he had said, watching her clean her equipment for the second time that day, "most soldiers prepare for the mission they expect. You need to prepare for the mission that surprises them." "Yes, Sergeant Major," she had said. "That means every night, not some nights, not the nights before the big operations." He had fixed her with the look of someone imparting something irreversible. "Every night, because you never know which night is the last easy one." She had taken that lesson and made it the architecture of her life. Every night, every check, every calibration, every quiet hour spent in the kind of readiness that feels to everyone watching exactly like nothing at all. Because that was the nature of real preparation. It was invisible until the moment it wasn't. She finished the last equipment check at 2300 hours. She filed the report. She turned off the light. And as she walked back to her quarters through the Colorado night air, sharp with altitude and cold, in the particular silence of mountains that have seen everything, she looked up once at the dark outline of the peaks surrounding Fort Raven Ridge. She had studied those peaks. She knew them the way you know something when your professional life depends on understanding it completely. She knew Black Canyon Pass. She knew the elevation shifts, the natural choke points, the places where visibility failed and where it widened unexpectedly. She knew where sound traveled in unusual ways and where it was swallowed by terrain. She knew the wind patterns at different times of day and the way temperature changes affected the air density in ways that mattered enormously to anyone doing precision work at distance. She knew all of this because nobody had asked her to know it. She had learned it because she was the kind of soldier who prepared for the mission that surprises everyone. Standing in the cold mountain night, she allowed herself one moment of something that was not quite prayer and not quite resolve, but something in between. She did not ask to be called. She did not demand recognition. She did not rehearse the vindication she deserved. She simply said into the dark, in the altitude, in the silence, "I'll be ready." Then she went inside. And she slept the way only truly prepared people sleep, completely, without the restless turning of someone who is still trying to outthink tomorrow. The convoy rolled out at 05:30 the following morning. 12 vehicles, 23 soldiers, critical equipment bound for a forward position that needed it badly enough that the mission was moving, despite weather reports that were not quite alarming, but were not quite comfortable either. Captain Reed stood at the departure point with the settled authority of someone in complete control of the situation. He briefed Specialist Carver one final time on the Overwatch protocols. Carver nodded the way young soldiers nod when they don't want to admit they're uncertain. Chin down, eyes up, jaw set. The particular performance of confidence in the face of doubt. Reed didn't notice, or maybe he noticed and decided it wasn't his problem. The convoy moved. Fort Raven Ridge settled into its operational quiet. The reduced tempo of a base with a major element deployed the remaining personnel, maintaining readiness and managing communications and waiting. Claire was at her post in the communications section at 05:45. Her equipment was perfect. Her reports were current. Her body was still. Her mind was not. Her mind was in Black Canyon Pass, because that was where the mission was, and the mission was what mattered. She tracked the convoy's position through the standard check-ins, each transmission confirming location, status, route, progression. The convoy moved through the foothills, gained elevation, entered the first series of mountain switchbacks. Check-in at 06:30, clean. Check-in at 0700, clean. 0722, nothing. A missed check-in is not immediately alarming. Equipment issues happen. Terrain interference happens. You note it. You wait, you attempt contact, you escalate, only when the silence continues long enough to mean something. 0735, still nothing. The communications section was no longer quiet. Specialist Torres, the other comm technician on duty, looked at Claire with eyes that were asking a question he didn't want to say out loud. Claire was already running alternative frequency checks, hands moving through the sequence with the speed and precision of someone who had done this, not in drills, but in the real weight of actual silence on the other end. "Try the backup frequency," she said, her voice perfectly level. Torres tried, static. "Primary relay," she said. Torres tried, nothing. Then the radio crackled. Not a clean transmission. Something broken and urgent and wrong. The specific quality of sound that every communications specialist learns to dread, because it means whatever is being transmitted is coming from someone who does not have time to transmit it properly. Words came through in fragments. Contact. Multiple positions. "We are need." Then the voice of Specialist David Carver, the man chosen over Claire Whitmore for the Overwatch position that was supposed to protect all of them. His voice was not the voice of someone in control. It was high and fast and carrying the particular frequency of someone whose training has met a situation that the training was not quite enough to cover. I can't get a fix on their positions. There's too many. The radio filled with the sounds of a battlefield. Claire heard it all, every detail, every second. And in the communications section of Fort Raven Ridge, in the place where she had been told she belonged because she wasn't needed anywhere more important. Sergeant Claire Whitmore stood up from her chair. She looked at Torres. Get Captain Reed, she said. Sergeant. Now, she said, still quiet, still completely controlled, the same tone she used for every request, every instruction, every moment of every day. But there was something underneath it now that Torres felt without being able to name. He went, and Claire was already moving toward her gear. The command center erupted when Captain Reed arrived, and the full picture of the radio transmissions became clear. 23 soldiers, pinned down in Black Canyon Pass. Enemy position and throughout the terrain using the elevation and the natural cover of the canyon walls in a coordinated attack pattern that had disabled 2 vehicles in the first minutes of contact. No Overwatch support, no accurate enemy position data, no way forward, and no safe path back. Reed's face had changed. It was a particular change, the kind that happens when the settled certainty of someone who believes they have control meets the specific reality of a situation that has removed that control entirely and placed it somewhere they cannot reach. He was shouting into the radio. He was barking orders at the personnel in the command center. He was doing everything a commander does when the situation is critical and the options are narrowing. He had not yet processed the full implication of every choice he had made in the last 72 hours. That reckoning was still coming. What arrived first was Claire Whitmore, standing in the doorway of the command center equipment, already configured, ready to move. Reed turned. He saw her. For the first time in 7 months, Mason Reed looked at Sergeant Claire Whitmore without the comfortable certainty of someone who already knows what they're seeing. Whitmore, he said, and her name in his mouth for the first time sounded different. Not like the punchline of a joke, like a question. She met his eyes, and all she said was, "Sir, I need authorization to move to the Black Canyon observation point." A silence in the command center that lasted perhaps 2 full seconds. In those 2 seconds, the radio behind Reed transmitted another broken fragment from 23 trapped soldiers. "Sergeant Whitmore moving," she said. She didn't wait for him to find his answer. She was already gone. Ethan Brooks was waiting outside the command center. He had his equipment. It was already dressed for the terrain. He was not surprised to see her. "Spotter," he said. "Spotter," she confirmed. They moved together into the mountain morning, toward the high ground above Black Canyon Pass, toward the silence, where the mission had broken down, toward the moment that had been counting down since the day a room full of soldiers laughed, and the only person who didn't laugh had simply walked away and kept preparing. The mountains were cold and indifferent and ancient. They did not care who people thought Claire Whitmore was. They only cared what she could do, and she was about to show them. 23 soldiers were waiting, 26 targets were hiding, and the most dangerous person at Fort Raven Ridge had finally been given permission to be exactly who she had always been. She moved like someone who had been waiting for this her entire career. Because she had, the observation point above Black Canyon Pass was not a place you reached easily. It required climbing. It required moving across exposed terrain at an angle that punished every joint and burned every muscle that wasn't completely conditioned for altitude work. Most soldiers at Fort Raven Ridge had never gone up that route. Some had tried during training exercises and turned back when the air thinned and the ground shifted and the body started sending signals that the brain wasn't ready to override. Claire didn't slow down once. Ethan Brooks stayed with her, matching her pace with the focused effort of someone who had trained hard specifically because he believed deep in the analytical part of himself that never fully stopped running calculations that a day like this one was coming. He hadn't known exactly when. He hadn't known exactly how. But 7 weeks of watching Claire Whitmore told him that the day would arrive when stillness became movement and invisibility became the most visible thing on the battlefield. He had prepared his body for that day the same way she prepared her equipment every night quietly without announcement. Now they moved together through the mountain cold toward the high ground, while below them in the canyon the sounds of the battle carried upward in the strange acoustic way that elevated terrain sometimes amplifies things it should swallow. They could hear it before they could see it. The sharp percussion of controlled fire, the different texture of suppressed versus open positions, the particular quality of radio traffic from soldiers under active contact clipped, urgent stripped of everything except the essential words that might keep someone alive for another 60 seconds. Ethan heard it and felt something cold in his chest that wasn't the altitude. Claire heard it and moved faster. "How much further?" Ethan said, not complaining, calculating. He needed the timeline. 4 minutes, she said, maybe 3.5. They've been in contact for 11 minutes already. I know, she said. She didn't say what they both knew. That 11 minutes of sustained contact in terrain like that, without effective overwatch support, with two vehicles already disabled and enemy positions unidentified, produced a specific and worsening math. Every minute was a number. Every number had a human face attached to it. 3.5 minutes felt like a very long time. They covered it in 3. The observation point was a natural formation elevated rock with a sight line that opened over the full length of Black Canyon Pass. It was exactly the kind of position that a skilled long-range specialist identifies the moment they study terrain, the way a musician identifies the acoustic center of a room the moment they walk in. It was the place that made everything else possible. Claire reached it and was already configured before Ethan finished clearing the approach. She moved without wasted motion. Each action followed the next in the seamless sequence of someone who has performed these preparations so many times that they have stopped being conscious actions and become simply the language her body speaks when the work begins. Ethan settled beside her. He pulled out his spotting equipment, oriented himself to the canyon below, and began the rapid process of establishing reference points. On the radio, clipped to Claire's left shoulder, the transmissions from the convoy were continuous now, no longer fragmentary. The soldiers on the ground had re-established communication, which meant they were alive and fighting, which was the only information that mattered right now. But the content of those transmissions was not good. The convoy commander, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, had taken over the radio from Carver at some point in the last few minutes. Rodriguez was experienced. His voice was controlled in the way that soldiers who have been in real contact learn to control it, not because they aren't afraid, but because fear costs time, and time is the only currency that matters in these moments. Command, we have 2 vehicles immobilized at the South Bend. I have 3 wounded. I have enemy fire from at least 4 separate positions, and I cannot get a fix on them from ground level. Carver cannot acquire targets from the observation point. I need overwatch support, or I need an extraction route. I need something. Over. The command center responded. Reed's voice stripped of everything except the functional language of operational necessity. Roger, Rodriguez, working on overwatch support. Maintain your position. Over. Maintain your position. The instruction of commanders who have run out of immediate answers and need 60 more seconds to find one. Rodriguez knew what it meant. His voice didn't change. Understood. Maintaining. Out. Claire heard all of it. Her hands were already working. Talk to me, she said to Ethan, her eye finding the first reference point through her scope. Ethan was scanning. His spotting equipment was good, and his eyes were better, the product of the same kind of relentless preparation that had made him the right person to be beside her right now. South Canyon Wall, second shelf from the top, he said. I have movement, irregular, not consistent with weather or wildlife. Direction 11 o'clock from the convoy's lead vehicle, upper shelf. Claire moved her scope, found the reference, began reading the position the way you read text when you've been reading the same language your entire adult life, not letter by letter, but in complete meaning, absorbed instantly. I see it, she said, then immediately wind. Ethan checked. 7 miles per hour, west-northwest, consistent. Elevation difference from our position to target, 40 meters drop, approximately 860 meters range. Claire was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, she was not thinking in words. She was thinking in the language of physics and preparation and the 1,000 hours of practice that had built in her hands and her breath and her body, an understanding of this specific intersection of variables that no amount of verbal explanation could fully translate. She made her adjustment. She inhaled. She exhaled half of it. She held. Ethan was watching the target position through his spotting scope, because what happened next had to be observed and confirmed, and Rodriguez and his soldiers needed to know the exact moment the equation changed. The moment came, and then the first position was gone. Ethan was already on the radio before he consciously decided to speak. Command, this is Brooks at the observation point. Overwatch is established. First target neutralized. Convoy first enemy position eliminated. South Canyon Wall second shelf. You are clear on your 11 o'clock. Over. The radio silence that followed lasted approximately 1.5 seconds. Then Rodriguez, say again, command. Ethan, overwatch is established. First target neutralized. Your 11 o'clock is clear. Confirm. A beat. Then Rodriguez, and in his voice something that was not quite disbelief, but was something adjacent to it, the recalibration of a man who has been in an impossible situation and has just received information that changes the geometry of that situation in a way he didn't expect. Confirmed. 11 o'clock clear. What is your position? Who is up there? Ethan looked at Claire. She was already moving to the next position. She hadn't paused. She hadn't waited for confirmation. The first one was done. The second one was already being read. Sergeant Whitmore, Ethan said into the radio. Is your overwatch? Another beat. Rodriguez said nothing for a moment. Then simply, tell her she's got 22 people who are very glad she's there. She knows, Ethan said. In the command center at Fort Raven Ridge, Captain Mason Reed heard every word of that exchange. He was standing at the communications bank and with his arms crossed, and his jaw set the physical posture of a man working very hard to maintain the appearance of control over a situation that has quietly removed that control from him and placed it somewhere else. He heard Rodriguez's voice. He heard Ethan's voice. He heard the name. Whitmore. Something moved across his face. The people in the command center who were watching him saw it, though none of them would have been able to articulate exactly what it was. It was the expression of a man encountering at significant velocity the weight of a choice he made 3 days ago, feeling it arrive not as an abstraction, but as a physical fact transmitted through a radio in real time, while 22 soldiers waited in a canyon for a woman he had laughed at to keep them alive. What's her current status, he said. His voice was completely flat, not because he was indifferent, because something else was happening in there that he wasn't ready to show. Torres answered him from the communications panel. Engage, sir. Second target confirmed, moving to third. Reed said nothing. He stood at the radio and he listened. And the room around him understood, in the way that rooms understand things, without anyone saying them, that everything had shifted. On the ridge above Black Canyon Pass, Ethan Brooks was earning every part of his role. A spotter's job sounds to people who have never done it like a secondary function. The shooter shoots. The spotter just watches. But anyone who has ever done this work in real conditions knows that it is a full partnership and that the quality of the spotting determines the quality of the shooting. And that in conditions like these, multiple targets, moving positions, deteriorating weather beginning to show on the western horizon. Soldiers on the ground, whose safety depends on the speed and accuracy of every call, the spotter is carrying exactly as much of the mission as the shooter. Ethan was carrying it. Third position, he said. North Ridge, moving. They're repositioning. Direction of movement. East along the ridge. Slow, maybe 40 meters since first contact. They know we're up here, Claire said. It was not a question. Yeah, Ethan said. They figured it out after the second one. How long before they can get fire on this position? Ethan did the calculation. If they have someone designated for counter overwatch, which they probably do, maybe 6 minutes. Maybe less, depending on their angle. 6 minutes. In the canyon below, Rodriguez had reorganized his soldiers the moment the first two enemy positions went silent. He was a good commander, the kind who, when the equation changes, doesn't spend time processing the change, but immediately begins exploiting it. He had moved his wounded back behind the disabled vehicles. He had repositioned his shooters to take advantage of the cleared angles. He was fighting his way toward a position where, if the overwatch held, he might actually be able to extract his people. But the enemy was adapting. This was the thing about a coordinated attack in terrain like Black Canyon Pass. The people who had planned it were not random. They had chosen the location deliberately. They had positioned their people with knowledge of the canyon's geometry. They understood Overwatch. They had planned for it, which was why the first Overwatch had failed. And now that an unexpected Overwatch had established itself and destroyed their initial positions, they were not retreating. They were adjusting. This was the mini-climax that nobody in the command center was ready for. Torres's voice came through the radio directed at Ethan. Brooks were reading radio activity consistent with a counter-positioning movement on the North Ridge. They may be trying to flank the observation point. Already on it, Ethan said. How was? He had been tracking the movement for 90 seconds without breaking his spotting rhythm. The counter-overwatch move was the expected response, and he had been watching for it since the second shot. It was the thing he would have done if their positions were reversed, and he respected the tactical intelligence of the enemy, enough to assume they would recognize the same necessity. Claire, he said, keeping his voice even, because keeping his voice even was how he gave her the best possible information. We have a secondary problem developing on the North Ridge. I think they're sending someone for counter-overwatch. Time to intercept. If I'm reading their movement right, they'll have an angle on us in approximately 4 minutes. Maybe 5. That's not much. No, he agreed, it's not. A beat between them. Then Claire said, how many targets still active in the canyon? Rodriguez reported contact from at least 4 positions after we cleared the first 2. We've handled 3. Minimum of 2 remaining confirmed, possibly 3 more unconfirmed. 4 minutes, she said. She was not saying it with fear. She was saying it the way a surgeon says the name of the next instrument, naming the constraint, understanding the constraint, beginning immediately to work within it. Talk me on to the next one, she said. Ethan went back to his scope. Canyon floor east side, partially concealed. They're using the vehicle chassis for cover, the second disabled truck. They positioned there after we cleared the ridge. They're using our people's own equipment. Something sharp moved through the air between them, because using a disabled vehicle as cover meant they were positioned dangerously close to the soldiers sheltering behind that same vehicle. Any engagement at that angle required a level of precision that moved the calculation into a different category entirely. Ethan said it flat, it's tight. Distance, 700 meters, but the angle is the problem. We're shooting down at approximately 30 degrees. Wind has shifted slightly, coming more from the north now. How much shift? Maybe 2 degrees, maybe 3. Hard to be certain at this range with the canyon affecting the airflow. Claire was quiet, not hesitating, reading, processing the variables with the same speed and completeness she brought to everything, except that this particular set of variables had a human cost attached to it if the reading was wrong. Rodriguez, she said into the radio, her voice direct and clear, I need you to confirm the position of your people behind the second vehicle. Specifically, I need to know if anyone is on the east-facing side. Rodriguez's response was immediate. He understood the implication. Negative on east side. We've got 3 wounded sheltering on the west face of that vehicle. East side is open. Confirm no personnel east of that vehicle within 15 meters. Confirmed. We pulled everyone back when they repositioned there. It's clear. Copy, Claire said. She made her adjustment for the angle shift in the wind change. A different set of numbers from the previous shots. A different geometry. The same absolute requirement for accuracy attached now to a different and more specific kind of consequence. Ethan watched through his scope. He didn't breathe. I was not embarrassed by this. Holding his breath at this moment was not weakness. It was the honest physical acknowledgement that what was about to happen mattered, and that some part of his body understood that even if his training kept the rest of him still and steady. The shot happened. The 4th position went silent. Ethan exhaled. Target neutralized, he said, then immediately back to the North Ridge counter-overwatch team. They've cleared the last natural cover on their route. We're at maybe 2.5 minutes. This was the moment that changed the texture of everything. Because 2.5 minutes was not enough time to complete the remaining confirmed targets in the canyon, verify the unconfirmed positions, and also address the team moving to take their observation point. Something had to give. And in the next breath, something did, but not the way either of them expected. Rodriguez's voice came back on the radio. Overwatch, I have a visual on movement North Ridge, your left flank. I count 2 individuals moving through the rocks at approximately 200 meters below your position. We see them, Ethan confirmed. I can put fire on that ridge from our current position, Rodriguez said. I'm not going to hit your point, but I can make their approach significantly more complicated. Claire heard this. She absorbed it. And something shifted in her expression. Not softening exactly, but something that acknowledged the nature of what was happening below her. 22 soldiers pinned in a canyon, 3 of them wounded under sustained enemy contact, and their commander was volunteering to complicate his own situation further in order to protect the Overwatch position that was protecting them. Tell him negative on the fire, Claire said. Tell him to use his people to move the wounded further west. I want distance between them and those remaining positions. Ethan related. Rodriguez, after a half-second pause. Copy that, moving wounded. What about the counter-overwatch? That's mine, Claire said. Ethan looked at her. She was already repositioning. Moving from the long-range configuration she had been using for the canyon targets and shifting her entire approach. Angle support position equipment adjustment for a closer, faster engagement. 2 minutes, Ethan said. I know, she said. They're not at 800 meters. I know that too, she said. Different problem, different solution. She found the angle. She found the movement. She let it develop for 4 more seconds, tracking it, confirming that what she was reading was exactly what she thought it was, because this was the kind of situation where the thing that appears to be the thing is sometimes not the thing, and the space between appearing and being is where catastrophic errors live. It was exactly what she thought it was. She made the adjustment. The counter-overwatch team stopped advancing. In the command center, the radio operator, Torres, had been maintaining a continuous log of every transmission, every confirmation, every moment in the engagement. He was doing it partly because it was his job and partly because he understood at some level below our operational procedure that what was being transmitted through these communications was something that would be talked about for a long time. He was on his 4th page. Captain Reed had not moved from the communications bank. He had not spoken in 11 minutes. The people around him were doing their jobs, maintaining situational awareness, managing logistics, preparing contingency resources, but they were also watching him. The way people in crisis situations always watch the person in authority reading the signals. The signals at this moment were very quiet. Reed was not a stupid man. He had made a specific kind of mistake, the kind built on assumptions rather than facts, but he was not stupid. And standing in that command center, listening to the radio traffic from Black Canyon Pass, he was understanding the nature of that mistake with a completeness and clarity that was both professional and deeply personal. I was understanding it the way you understand something when you can't look away from it. When the evidence arrives, not as a report on a page, but as a living, continuous, real-time demonstration that is impossible to rationalize or reframe or explain away. He had sent someone else. He had sent someone who froze. And the person he had laughed at in front of the entire unit out loud with the kind of easy contempt that assumed she would never be in a position to answer. It was currently holding the line that was keeping 22 of his soldiers alive. Sergeant Ortega, the young private who had seen Claire walk out of the briefing room and hadn't known what to do with what he'd witnessed, was standing against the wall of the command center. He had been assigned to logistics support for the mission, which meant he had a reason to be present, which meant he was watching everything. He watched Reed's face. He watched the radio. He watched the numbers on Torres's log climb as each new transmission came in. And he thought about what Claire had said in the corridor. It doesn't change my job today or tomorrow. He thought he understood what she meant then. He understood it completely now. She hadn't been talking about resignation. She hadn't been talking about acceptance. She had been talking about something so much harder and more specific than either of those things. She had been talking about the discipline of continuing to be exactly who you are and at full capacity, at full commitment, regardless of whether anyone around you is currently capable of recognizing it. She had been talking about the kind of integrity that doesn't require an audience, and she had been demonstrating it quietly every single day until the day the audience became irrelevant because the situation itself demanded the truth. On the ridge, the engagement entered its most intense phase. With the counter-overwatch threat neutralized, Claire returned her full attention to the canyon. But the enemy had used those minutes to complete a repositioning that complicated the remaining targets significantly. They've gone deeper into the canyon walls, Ethan said, his voice carrying the focused tension of a man reading a situation that has just become harder. East and west walls, natural alcoves. They're using the rock for maximum cover. I have a partial on one position east wall. The others I'm working. Partial won't do it, Claire said. I know, I need them to move. Then let's make them move. This was the tactical intelligence that formal training teaches in theory, but that real experience teaches in the gut, the understanding that in a fixed position, engagement, you can sometimes control the enemy's movement by controlling what they believe about your position and intentions. Make them uncertain, make them shift, and when they shift, they reveal themselves. Rodriguez, Ethan said into the radio, I need you to put controlled, deliberate fire on the East Canyon wall, not suppression, single-aim shots. Make them believe you have a fix on them from the ground. Rodriguez understood immediately. Copy, putting aimed fire on east wall, 3 rounds measured pace. On my mark. Ethan counted to himself, watching the east wall alcove, watching for the micro adjustment that would happen when the person sheltering there heard deliberate aimed fire from below and couldn't be certain whether the ground level shooter had genuinely acquired them. Mark, he said. Rodriguez fired. Deliberate, measured, convincing. The person in the east wall alcove moved, just slightly, just enough to change their angle of shelter. Just enough. East wall, Ethan said. You've got about 2 seconds. Claire was already there. The east wall position went silent. One confirmed, Ethan said. His voice had the particular flatness of a man in deep focus counting moving, not pausing for anything that doesn't advance the mission. West wall, still working. They're not moving. They're smarter than the others, Claire said. Yeah, Ethan agreed. They are. The west wall position was the last confirmed target. There were also 2 unconfirmed positions that Rodriguez had reported fire from, but that neither Claire nor Ethan had been able to directly observe. Unconfirmed in Overwatch terms doesn't mean absent. It means not yet visible. And not yet visible has a specific danger attached to it. Rodriguez, report on your current contact, Ethan said. Rodriguez, active fire from west wall. Nothing else in last 4 minutes. My 2 unconfirmed positions have been quiet. Could be they pulled back. Could be they're waiting. Could be waiting, Claire said quietly. Ethan looked at her. You think they've got something else? I think the people who plan this are not the kind of people who don't have a contingency, she said. We've cleared 5 confirmed. They had at least 7 planned positions based on what Rodriguez described in the first transmission. 2 are quiet. That math doesn't add up to retreat. This was the twist nobody in the command center saw coming. Because they had been focused on the active engagement, the visual confirmations, the transmission, updates, the narrowing count of enemy positions, and the momentum of progress creates a specific cognitive pull towards the conclusion that progress is nearing completion. But Claire's mind didn't work that way. Her mind worked in the reconnaissance logic. She had spent years developing the logic that says the absence of visible threat is not the same as the absence of threat, and that the moment you believe you're nearly done is often precisely when the problem reveals its final and most dangerous shape. She pulled back slightly from her position, just enough to widen her observation angle, not abandoning the canyon, maintaining it, while simultaneously opening her field to the wider terrain. Ethan, she said, check the approach road, south end where it enters the canyon. Ethan shifted his glass, 30 seconds of silence. Then movement, south entrance, vehicle mounted. They've got a vehicle waiting at the south entrance with, I count, 4 individuals. They're staged. There it was, the contingency. The plan within the plan that assumed the canyon positions would hold long enough to force the convoy into a specific extraction route, and the extraction route led directly through the south entrance, where a stage element was waiting to complete what the canyon positions had started. Rodriguez had been about to call for extraction through the south entrance. Another 60 seconds and he would have moved his wounded toward that route. Ethan was on the radio before the thought finished forming. Rodriguez, do not, I repeat, do not attempt extraction through the south entrance. We have a staged element at the south entrance, 4 personnel vehicle mounted. You are not clear on that road. Rodriguez's response took a full 3 seconds. 3 seconds in that context was a very long time. When he came back, his voice was carrying something underneath the operational control, something that was the sound of a man who has just comprehended in real time how close a catastrophic outcome had been. Confirmed, holding position, waiting on your call. Ethan looked at Claire. West wall first, she said, then the south entrance. That's 2 different ranges, 2 completely different angles. I know. You'll need to completely reconfigure between them. I know, she said again, calmly, completely, with the patience of someone who has had this conversation with herself many times before, in the long private hours of preparation that nobody ever sees, and who has already made the decision that she can do this because she has done the specific work that makes this kind of decision real rather than just brave. West wall first, Ethan said. I'll call the south entrance the moment you're reconfigured. They worked. The west wall position fell. Claire moved. The reconfiguration took 47 seconds. In those 47 seconds, Ethan maintained surveillance on the south entrance, tracking, counting, reading the body language of the 4-stage personnel who had no idea the Overwatch position had already pivoted toward them. They found out. The stage element at the south entrance was neutralized in 3 engagements. When the last one was called, the canyon went quiet. Not the silence of suppression, not the temporary silence of an enemy holding breath, the actual silence of an engagement that has reached its conclusion. Ethan looked at his radio and realized he didn't have a count in his head. He had been too deep in the work to track the running total. He pulled out the small pad he always carried and looked at the marks he'd made, one for each confirmed, which was a habit from his intelligence work. The systematic documentation of what is known versus what is assumed. He counted again. He looked at Claire. 26, he said. She was already beginning the methodical process of standing down from her position, the same organized, unhurried sequence she used when starting it. Equipment checked. Configuration documented. Nothing left to chance. Nothing abandoned. She paused when he said the number. Not a dramatic pause. Just a breath. Then she said, "How many of Rodriguez's people are hit?" 3 wounded, none critical according to the last report. 2 vehicles disabled. Everyone else. "Get me the status on the wounded," she said. Not the target count, not the confirmation, not any part of the reckoning with what she had just done or what it meant or how it would be received. The wounded. Ethan got on the radio. "Rodriguez, wounded status, over." Rodriguez came back. 2 walking wounded, 1 non-ambulatory specialist, Chen, left leg below the knee. Significant but stable. He needs extraction and medical attention, but he's stable. Claire was already packing her equipment, but something in Rodriguez's voice, specifically in the word non-ambulatory, caught in her chest the way certain words do when you are listening for what they actually mean rather than what they say. Non-ambulatory, cannot walk, cannot move himself, is currently lying on the ground in Black Canyon Pass behind a disabled vehicle, while the extraction route that should have been clear is now something they are confirming and clearing. And the wounded always move last in these situations, and moving last means staying exposed longest. Claire was listening to a second transmission. Rodriguez organizing his soldiers for the extraction, coordinating with the command center, managing the logistics of moving a convoy with disabled vehicles and 3 wounded, when she heard something that stopped her from completing her pack. Rodriguez mid-transmission to one of his soldiers. "Chen needs to stay with the vehicle until we can get a medic forward to stabilize for transport. Get him secured," and then under the operational transmission, barely audible, but unmistakably real, the voice of Specialist Chen, 23 years old, first deployment, lying on the ground with a wounded leg in a canyon that 12 minutes ago was a killing zone. I'm good, just I'm okay." The voice of someone trying to be small, trying to not be a burden, trying even while injured and frightened and exhausted to make it easier for everyone else. Claire stopped moving. She looked at Ethan. "Where is Chen's position?" Rodriguez said, "Behind the second vehicle, east side sheltered." "Can the medevac reach that position within the next 40 minutes? Ethan checked the communication log, did the calculation. 40 minutes minimum, probably closer to 60 depending on the extraction coordination. Claire closed her equipment bag. "I'm going down," she said. Ethan looked at her, not with surprise, with the expression of someone receiving information that they expected and had already processed. "The canyon's cleared," he said. "We confirmed 26. "I'm not going down for the enemy," she said. "I'm going down for Chen." "A beat," Ethan nodded slowly. "You have medical training." "I have enough," she said. And then in the same movement, without ceremony or announcement, without waiting for anyone's permission or approval or recognition, Sergeant Claire Whitmore picked up her equipment and began moving down from the observation point toward the canyon floor, toward the soldier who was trying to sound okay, toward the part of the mission that didn't show up on the target count. Ethan keyed his radio. "Command, this is Brooks. Overwatch engagement is complete. 26 confirmed. Canyon is clear. Sergeant Whitmore is moving to assist wounded personnel at Vehicle 2. Requesting medevac coordination for Specialist Chen, non-ambulatory, left leg injury stable. Over." The command center went quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then Torres's voice, and in his voice, something that had not been there at the beginning of this engagement. Something raw and unguarded and completely honest. "Copy that, Brooks. 26 confirmed. Medevac coordinating now." A pause that lasted precisely 1 beat longer than operational necessity required. And Brooks tell her she's cleared to move. Ethan looked down the ridge where Claire was already 20 meters below him, moving through terrain like someone who had always known the way. She didn't wait, he said. In the command center, Torres heard this. He looked at Captain Reed. And Captain Reed, standing at the communications bank, where he had stood for the last 28 minutes, listening to every word of everything that had happened in Black Canyon Pass, turned and looked at the map on the wall. He didn't say anything. But his hand, which had been resting on the communications panel, in the locked-still posture he'd held for half an hour, came down to his side. And his fingers just briefly curled into a fist. Not with anger, with the physical language of a man absorbing something that cannot be unfelt. Down in the canyon, Rodriguez heard Claire's voice on the radio before he saw her. "Rodriguez, this is Whitmore. I'm coming to your position. I need your wounded soldier's exact location and current status." Rodriguez paused in his coordination for exactly 1 moment. "Whitmore," he said, and in the way he said her name, the weight of it, the specific quality of 2 syllables, carrying more than 2 syllables can normally carry, he communicated everything he didn't have words for. "China's behind vehicle 2, west face 12 o'clock from the front bumper. He's got a field dressing on the wound, lost some blood, he's alert." "I'm 3 minutes out," she said. "Whitmore," Rodriguez said again. "Go ahead," she said, still moving a beat. "All of us, everyone in this canyon right now?" He stopped, started again. "Just get here." "Already coming," she said, and the radio went quiet. And the canyon, which 28 minutes ago had been a trap that was closing on 23 soldiers, was just a canyon again. Cold, high, ancient, indifferent to everything except what was actually true. And what was actually true was that Claire Whitmore was moving through it toward the person who needed her the way she had always moved toward everything that mattered. Without announcement, without hesitation, without waiting for anyone to tell her she was allowed. She reached Chen in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Not 3 minutes, 2:40, because somewhere between leaving the ridge and hitting the canyon floor, her pace had increased in the way that pace increases when the body stops calculating distance and starts responding to something more immediate. The image of a 23-year-old soldier lying on cold ground, pressing a field dressing against his own leg, telling anyone who would listen that he was fine. Rodriguez saw her before his soldiers did. He was standing at the corner of the disabled vehicle, managing the coordination of the walking wounded and the extraction logistics when he caught movement on his left flank, and his hand went instinctively to his weapon before his eyes registered who it was. He lowered his hand. He didn't say anything for a moment, just watched her move. Later, when he was asked to describe it, he would struggle, not because he lacked words, but because the thing he was trying to describe was not visible in the way that most things soldiers describe are visible. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the slow motion arrival of a symbol or a savior. It was something quieter and more complete than that. It was the arrival of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and was simply doing it without any of the performance that people add to moments they know are being watched. She crossed to Chen without breaking stride. She dropped to one knee. Specialist Marcus Chen was 23 years old from Tucson, Arizona, and he had been lying on the canyon floor for 29 minutes with a wound that hurt more than he had ever been hurt in his life, and less than he was willing to admit to anyone in his unit. He had his left hand pressed over the field dressing. His right hand was flat on the ground. His face had the particular quality of someone maintaining consciousness through deliberate effort, jaw set, eyes focused on a specific point, breath controlled in the way that only works if you pay attention to it every single second. He heard Boots stop beside him. He looked up. He didn't recognize her. Not immediately. She was in full kit face, partially obscured, coming from a direction that made no sense given where the rest of his unit was positioned. Who he started. "Whitmore," she said, "don't move your hand." She was already looking at the dressing, reading the wound, the way she read everything completely rapidly, without the hesitation of someone figuring it out, and without the theatrical calm of someone performing competence. "Who applied this dressing?" "I did," he said. "How long ago?" "Right after, maybe 20 minutes, maybe more." She checked the dressing, checked his color, checked his eyes, all of it in about 8 seconds. "You did good," she said, and the way she said it was not soothing or performative. It was a direct assessment delivered as a fact, which was somehow more reassuring than anything warmer would have been. "Bleed through is controlled. You haven't lost as much as you think you have." "Feels like a lot," he said. It always does, she said. She was already working hands moving through the medical kit she'd carried down from the ridge. Tell me your pain level. 6, he said immediately. She looked at him. 7, he said. Marcus, she said, using his first name because she had heard Rodriguez use it in a transmission, and she understood that first names do something in moments like this that last names can't. I'm not grading you. I need accurate information to give you the right support. Pain level. A beat. 8, he said quietly. 8.5. Good, she said. Honest is better. This is going to feel worse before it feels better. Tell me if anything changes. Okay, he said, and then because he was 23 and because the adrenaline was beginning its slow withdrawal and leaving behind it the rawer, more honest chemistry of a body that had been frightened for a long time. Are they gone? Is it over? Claire worked as she answered. It's over, she said. You're clear. Chin closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When he opened them, they were slightly brighter and slightly wetter than they had been before, and he was looking at the sky above the canyon with the expression of someone receiving information so significant that the body has to process it through every available channel at once. 26, he said. He'd been monitoring the radio from the ground the entire time. He knew the count. I heard Brooks on the radio. I heard the confirmations. He turned his head to look at her. That was you. She didn't answer. All of it, he said, not a question. Everyone. Stay still, she said. Sergeant Whitmore, he said. Chen. Thank you, he said. And his voice broke on the second word, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but in the small, specific way that voices break when they are carrying more than the words they're saying. When they're carrying the weight of a person who has just understood in a way that will not leave them how close a very different outcome had been. Claire's hands did not stop moving, but something in her face shifted, just slightly. The controlled professional surface remained steady focus present, but underneath it, something acknowledged the moment, not dismissed it, not deflected from it, just absorbed it the way she absorbed everything completely quietly and without making it about herself. Don't thank me yet, she said. I still have to get you out of here. From behind her, Rodriguez appeared at the corner of the vehicle. He had been watching the exchange from 10 feet away, because a commander always knows where his wounded are and what is happening to them, and because something about watching Claire work on Chen had held him in place with the same quality of attention that made it impossible to look away from something you need to understand. Medevac is 22 minutes out, he said. Claire looked up at him. First real look between them since she'd arrived in the canyon. They had spoken on the radio for 28 minutes. They had coordinated an engagement that saved 22 lives. But they were seeing each other's faces for the first time right now, and there was a specific weight to that. Rodriguez was a lean, direct man in his mid-30s with the kind of face that didn't move much unless it meant to. Right now it meant to. The look he gave her was not the look of a superior to a subordinate or of gratitude in its simple form. It was the look of one experienced soldier seeing another experienced soldier clearly and finding in that clarity something that recalibrated an entire context. Rodriguez, she said. Whitmore, he said. A half-second beat that carried more than either of them would have put into words. Your people fought well, she said. They're still here because of you, he said. Flat, direct. The kind of statement that in Rodriguez's vocabulary replaced every more emotional version of the same truth. They're still here because they helped, she said. I just cleared the lanes. Rodriguez looked at her for another moment. Then he turned back to his soldiers in his extraction coordination, because that was who he was, and that was what the moment required, and the moment after that required, and the moment after that. But as he turned, he said over his shoulder without looking back, you know what the worst part is, Whitmore? She waited. I heard Reed's briefing, he said. I heard what he said. I heard everyone laugh. She said nothing. And I didn't say a word, Rodriguez said. He stopped walking but didn't turn around. I should have. He went back to his soldiers. Claire watched him go. Then she went back to Chen. In the command center at Fort Raven Ridge, the next 22 minutes were the quietest sustained period in recent memory. Not because nothing was happening. A great deal was happening. All of it, important, all of it, being coordinated with the efficiency of a unit that knew its jobs and was doing them. But there was a quality to the silence underneath the activity that was different from the silence of routine operations. It was the silence of reckoning. Not everyone in that room had laughed in the briefing, Some had simply sat still. Some had looked at the floor. Some had followed the social gravity of the room with the passive compliance of people who had not yet learned that passive compliance in moments of injustice is its own category of choice. They were learning it now. Torres had stopped adding marks to his log. He had written 26 confirmed at the bottom of his final page, underlined it once, and then set down his pen with the particular deliberateness of someone punctuating something. Ortega, still against the wall, had his arms crossed and was looking at Captain Reed with an expression that was carefully neutral in the way that very young soldiers learn to make their faces carefully neutral when they are thinking something they have not yet decided whether they are allowed to think. Reed had moved finally from the communications bank. He was standing near the tactical map now, hands behind his back, looking at the canyon route that his soldiers were currently being extracted from. The medevac had lifted. Rodriguez had confirmed the extraction route was clear. The walking wounded were moving. Chen was being prepped for transport. The mission that was supposed to be simple, that had become a catastrophe, that had been pulled back from the edge of something irreversible by one person who had been standing in a corridor 3 days ago saying, "It doesn't change my job," was concluding. And then the radio carried one more transmission. Rodriguez, from the extraction point. "Command, this is Rodriguez, all personnel accounted for, 3 wounded in transit, non-critical. Extraction underway, mission complete." A pause that lasted a full beat longer than operational protocol required. "And command, for the record, I want it noted in the mission log that the successful resolution of this engagement is attributed to the Overwatch support provided by Sergeant Claire Whitmore. I want her name in that log. Over." Torres looked at Reed. Reed looked at the radio. He walked to it. He keyed the transmit. "Copy that, Rodriguez. Sergeant Whitmore's contribution is noted and will be recorded. All personnel return to base. Well done. Over." He released the key. The room was very quiet. Reed straightened up from the radio and turned around and looked at the room, at Torres, at Ortega, at the other personnel who had been there for all of it, and his face carried something that nobody in that room had seen on it before. Not uncertainty, not guilt in its simple form. Something more specific and more difficult. The expression of a man who has been confronted with a truth about himself that he cannot categorize as someone else's fault, and who is deciding in real time what kind of person he is going to be with that truth. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He said, "Torres, when Whitmore returns to base, I want a full debrief. Her Brooks Rodriguez, when he's back. Full debrief, full record. Nothing informal." "Yes, sir," Torres said. "And I want her complete service, Bible on my desk. The classified version, everything." Torres paused one beat. "Yes, sir." Reed turned back to the map. Nobody said anything. But Ortega, still against the wall, uncrossed his arms. And something in the command center, something in the texture of the air, in the way the people in that room were holding themselves, shifted. Not fixed, not resolved, not concluded in any clean or comfortable way, but shifted. Because that is how these things begin. Not with announcements or ceremonies or the formal language of change. They begin with one person in a room deciding to look at something true, and then another person watching them look, and then another, and then the decision quite individual, and then collective, that the looking cannot go backward. Claire arrived back at Fort Raven Ridge 1 hour and 17 minutes after she had left it. She came in through the secondary gate, the route she had taken on the way out, because she moved by habit toward the path that was efficient rather than the path that was visible. She had her equipment. She had her kit. She walked with the same measured, purposeful stride she always walked with. And the only thing that was different about her externally from the woman who had left that morning was that she was moving slightly more slowly than usual. And there was dried blood on her left sleeve from the work she had done on Chen. Not her blood, Chen's. She had carried it back with her the way you carry the evidence of the work that actually matters, not hidden, not displayed. Just present, just real. Ortega was near the secondary gate when she came through. He had come to that position deliberately, though, if asked, he would have found it difficult to explain exactly when he made the decision to be there. He had simply found himself walking that direction with about 15 minutes left before her estimated arrival, and he had not questioned the impulse. He saw her come through the gate. He straightened. She noticed him immediately. She noticed everything immediately. It was simply how she operated, and she slowed her pace just slightly. "Ortega," she said. "Sergeant Whitmore," he said. I didn't have a speech prepared. He was 22 years old and he had not yet developed the particular vocabulary that comes from having navigated many difficult moments. What he had was what he'd always had: an honest face and the inability to pretend he was feeling something. He wasn't feeling or not feeling something, he was. I heard the count, he said. On the radio, 26. I heard, she said. I just wanted to. He stopped, started over. The other day, in the corridor, I said it wasn't right what Captain Reed did. You did, she said, and you said it doesn't change your job. It didn't, she said. He looked at her, the honest look of someone who is trying to understand something larger than their current vocabulary, but who is not willing to stop trying. How do you do that, he said. How do you just keep going like it doesn't touch you? Claire stopped moving. Not a dramatic pause, just the stop of someone who has been asked a real question and is giving it a real answer rather than a convenient one. It touches me, she said. Everything touches me, Ortega. I'm not stone. She held his eyes. But there's a difference between being touched by something and being stopped by it. I learned that distinction a long time ago, and I've been practicing it ever since. He absorbed this. Does it get easier, he said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was honest in the way that good teachers are honest, not comforting, not harsh, but true in a way that respects the person being told. Some days, she said, but that's not really the goal. She started moving again. Sergeant Whitmore, he said one more time. She half turned. I won't stay quiet next time, he said. It came out simple, unadorned, the statement of someone making a promise they fully intend to keep. Claire looked at him for one full second. Then something crossed her face that was quiet and brief and genuine, not a performance of approval, but the real thing. The acknowledgement of someone who understands at this moment, this small, unglamorous, uncelebrated decision made by a 22-year-old standing by a secondary gate was actually more important than the 26 confirmed targets. Because 26 targets and one engagement and one person deciding to stop staying quiet can change the shape of the next 20 years. Good, she said. She kept walking. The debrief was scheduled for 1800 hours. Claire had 3 hours between arrival and debrief. She used them the same way she used every available hour, methodically. Equipment cleaned and returned to its proper condition. Medical kit restocked from base supplies. Incident report drafted with the same factual precision she brought to every document she ever filed. Each action completed in full before the next began. Ethan found her in the equipment bay at 17:30. He sat down across from her without asking the same way he always did. For a while, neither of them said anything. It was the comfortable silence of two people who have been through something significant together and are still inside it in the way that people stay inside significant things for a while before they arrive on the other side. Finally, Ethan said, "How's Chen?" "Stable," she said. Medevac confirmed he's at the medical facility. Surgery went well. "Good," he said. Another silence. "Brooks," she said. "Yeah." "You were exactly right," she said. "As a spotter, every call, the counter overwatch move, that was you. The vehicle chassis position, that was your call on Rodriguez. The south entrance staging." She paused. "I could not have done what I did without what you gave me." Ethan looked at her. He was not a man who deflected easily or accepted compliments with false modesty, because he was too honest for either of those things. He took the assessment at its value. "You would have found a way," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but not as fast." And fast was the difference today. He nodded slowly. "Reed's called a full debrief," he said. "Classified record. Your full file on his desk." "I know," she said. "How do you feel about that?" She considered it. 7 months ago, she said. "I would have given a great deal for that file to be read. I requested a meeting with Reed in my second week." "Did you know that?" Ethan hadn't known. "He canceled it," she said, twice. "The third time I requested it, his aide told me the captain was satisfied with my current assignment." She said this without bitterness, as a fact, as data. "So I stopped requesting meetings and I started doing my job." "And now he's reading your file," Ethan said. "Now he's reading my file," she agreed, a beat. "Does it feel like justice?" Ethan said, not testing her, genuinely asking. He was an analyst. He wanted to understand. Claire was quiet for a moment. "It feels like math," she said finally. Like when you apply the correct variables, you eventually get the correct answer. Justice implies someone awarding something. This isn't an award. She looked at him steadily. This is just what was always true, arriving at the time when nobody could argue with it anymore. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Claire, he said, and in his voice for the first time in their months of working alongside each other, he dropped the professional wrapper entirely and spoke to her the way you speak to someone who has earned the very specific privilege of being spoken to honestly. What they did to you, what Reed did, what the unit did, what this place has done for 7 months, that wasn't just oversight. That wasn't just a missed file. No, she said. That was a choice, he said, repeated every day. Yes, she said. And you stayed, he said. I stayed, she confirmed. Why, he said. Genuinely, because you could have transferred. You had the record. You had the standing. You could have gone somewhere that would have seen you from day one. Claire set down the equipment she was working on and looked at him fully. Because the soldiers here are real, she said. Rodriguez's people are real. Chen is real. Ortega is real. The work this outpost does is real. She paused. I don't leave real things because of one wrong person. Ethan absorbed this. Even when the wrong person is the commanding officer, he said, especially then, she said, because that's when leaving costs the most. The equipment bay was quiet around them, the kind of quiet that follows something that needed to be said and has been. At exactly 1758, Claire stood straight in her uniform with the same practiced, unhurried motion she brought to everything and picked up her incident report. Debrief in 2 minutes, she said. I'll be there, Ethan said. She walked toward the door. Whitmore, Ethan said. She stopped. For the record, he said, I knew from the second week. She didn't turn around, but he saw her shoulders shift slightly, the smallest possible physical acknowledgement of something received. I know you did, she said. That's why I talked to you. She walked out. Ethan sat in the equipment bay for a moment after she left, listening to the sound of her boots on the corridor floor, steady and even, not slowing and not hurrying, exactly the pace she intended. The same pace she had always kept. Through 7 months of invisibility, through a briefing room full of laughter, through a ridge above a canyon where 26 targets had been waiting, through a wounded soldier who needed someone to come to him rather than wait for a medevac. The same pace, unhurried, unbroken, exactly herself. He stood up, straightened his own uniform, and followed her down the corridor toward the debrief room where Captain Mason Reed was waiting with her file open on the table in front of him, reading the classified version of the truth he should have read 7 months ago. The debrief room at Fort Raven Ridge held 8 people at exactly 1800 hours. Rodriguez had been brought in from the extraction point by helicopter 30 minutes ahead of schedule, his request, which said everything about the kind of man he was. He came in still carrying the dust of Black Canyon Pass on his uniform, declined the offer to clean up first, and took the seat to the left of the door with the settled, direct posture of someone who had things to say and intended to say them completely. Ethan sat beside Claire. Torres was present as the recording officer, his log already open, pen-ready face carrying the careful neutrality of someone who understood that what happened in this room in the next hour would be read by people who weren't in it. 3 other personnel, the operations officer, the base intelligence lead, and a senior NCO named Sergeant First Class Darden, who had been at Fort Raven Ridge longer than anyone else in the room, filled the remaining seats. Captain Mason Reed sat at the head of the table. Claire's classified service file was open in front of him. He had been reading it for 2 hours and 40 minutes. There were pages with handwritten notes in the margins, his own handwriting, which nobody in the room had seen before, on a personnel file, because Reed was not by habit a man who wrote in margins. He was a man who made decisions and moved forward. The notes in the margins were evidence of a different kind of engagement with information, the kind that happens when you are not skimming for confirmation, but reading for truth. He looked up when Claire came in. She met his eyes immediately, not aggressively, not with the performance of someone making a point. Simply the direct, steady gaze of someone who has nothing to hide and never did. Reed said, Sergeant, sit down, please. Please, a word he did not commonly deploy in operational settings. Torres noted it without writing it down. Claire sat. Reed looked around the room once. Then he closed the file, not putting it away, just closing it, the way you close something you have finished reading and now carry inside you. And he said, before we begin the formal debrief, I need to say something that is not part of the official record. Torres stopped writing for a moment. Torres stopped. Reed looked at Claire. 3 days ago, he said, I stood in a briefing room and I dismissed you in front of your entire unit. I dismissed you publicly with contempt, and I allowed a culture that was already wrong to become worse in that moment because I validated it out loud. He did not break eye contact. I was wrong, not mistaken wrong. There's a difference, and I want to be specific about it. A mistake is made in the absence of information. What I did was made in the presence of assumptions I chose not to question. That's a different category of failure. It's a leadership failure. The room was very still. Nobody moved. Nobody shifted in their seats. The particular stillness of people who are listening to something they did not expect to hear said this plainly in this room by this person. Reed continued, 22 soldiers came home from Black Canyon Pass today. One of them is in surgery right now, and his prognosis is good. That outcome belongs to the work done by Sergeant Whitmore and Sergeant Brooks. I want that stated clearly, and I want it in the record. He nodded at Torres. Torres started writing again. Sergeant Whitmore, Reed said, and now his voice had changed slightly. Not softer exactly, but different. Carrying more weight. The voice of someone who has set something down and is speaking from underneath that rather than on top of it. I owe you an apology, a real one, not a procedural statement, a real one. What I did was wrong and you deserve better from your commanding officer. The room waited. Claire looked at Reed for a long moment, not making him wait, genuinely processing. Because this was not the moment she had rehearsed in any version of her imagination over the past 7 months. She had not imagined Reed apologizing. She had not imagined this room, this stillness, these specific words in this specific order. She had simply done her job every day, and now she was here and the apology was real, and she had to decide what to do with a real thing. Sir, she said, her voice was measured and direct in the way it always was. I accept that, genuinely. A pause. But I have a condition. Something moved across Reed's face, not defensiveness, something more like recognition, the expression of a man who expected this, who would have been more concerned if it had not come. Name it, he said. Don't just apologize to me, Claire said. Fix the system so the next soldier doesn't have to prove themselves during a crisis. She held his eyes. There are people at this outpost right now whose files haven't been read, whose capabilities haven't been assessed, who are sitting in the wrong assignments because someone decided what they were before they bothered to look. She didn't raise her voice. She never raised her voice. Fix that, not because of what happened today. Because it's the right structure for a unit that has to depend on every person in it. Reed was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he said, that's not a condition, that's a mandate. And it should have been policy before you got here. Rodriguez from his seat said nothing. But his jaw moved slightly, the contained version of an agreement that a man like Rodriguez expresses with the minimum possible external signal. Darden, the senior NCO, who had been at Fort Raven Ridge longer than anyone, made a sound that was not quite a word. It was the kind of sound that carries decades of accumulated understanding about what should have been different and wasn't, and what might be different now. Torres wrote everything down. The formal debrief that followed lasted 1 hour and 50 minutes. It was thorough. It was technical. It covered every engagement in sequential order, every decision, every calculation, every radio transmission, every variable that had affected the outcome. Claire presented her account with the same factual precision she brought to every report she had ever filed, not dramatized, not minimized, simply accurate in a way that left no room for interpretation. Rodriguez's account corroborated every detail from the ground-level perspective. Ethan's account provided the spotting data, the timeline, the confirmation numbers. When they reached the section on Specialist Carver, the soldier who had been given the overwatch position over Claire, and who had frozen under pressure, Reed handled it with a directness that surprised the room. He didn't protect the decision. He didn't reframe it. He said flatly that Carver had been assigned to a role he was not prepared for, that the preparation failure was a command responsibility, and that the after-action documentation would reflect that. Carver himself was not in the room. He had requested to be. Reed had declined the request, not punitively, but because this debrief was not the venue for Carver to process what had happened to him. That was a different conversation for a different setting, and it required the kind of care that a formal debrief room did not provide. At 20:45, nearly 3 hours after the debrief began, Reed called a brief recess. People moved. Torres refilled his water. Rodriguez rolled his shoulders with the stiffness of a man who had been in sustained high alert for most of the day, and whose body was beginning to communicate the cost of that. Ethan stepped out into the corridor for air. Claire stayed at the table. Darden, the senior NCO, stayed too. He refilled his own water, moved to the window, looked at the darkness outside it for a moment, then turned and looked at Claire. "I've been here 6 years, Darden said. He was a big, deliberate man in his late 40s, with the weathered patience of someone who has seen enough institutional failure to stop being surprised by it and enough genuine excellence to still be moved by it. I've seen soldiers come through this outpost who deserve better than they got. More than I'd like to admit." Claire watched him. "I saw your name on the duty roster when you arrived," he said. "Saw your assignment, comms and support." He paused. "I didn't pull your file either." The admissions sat in the air between them. "Darden," she said. "I'm not looking for absolution," he said. "I'm just being accurate. I had the access and the habit of reading files, and I didn't read yours, and I've been asking myself since 1800 hours what exactly I was busy with instead." He looked at her steadily. "I don't have a good answer." "Sometimes there isn't one," she said. "No," he agreed. "Sometimes there's just what you do next." This was the first moment in the entire day, in the entire 7 months if honest, that Claire felt something loosen slightly. Not the controlled surface, deeper than that. Some interior tension that had been maintained so long and so consistently that she had almost forgotten it was tension and not simply the shape of her. Something in Darden's honesty, its lack of self-protection, its refusal to explain itself into something smaller than it was, reached somewhere that even Rodriguez's respect in Ethan's loyalty had not quite reached. Because Darden was not someone who had believed in her early. He was someone who was telling the truth about not having looked without wrapping that truth in anything comfortable. And there is a specific kind of integrity in that, which is different from every other kind. "Thank you," she said. Quiet, direct, no more than it needed to be. Darden nodded once and went back to his seat. When Reed returned from the recess, he brought something with him that changed the temperature of the room in the way that significant information always changes temperature, not with drama, but with the specific gravity of a decision that has already been made and is now being delivered. He sat down. He placed a document on the table. He did not make people wait. "The base commander has been briefed on the full engagement outcome," Reed said. "He's reviewing the formal record, which will be complete by end of week. But he's asked me to convey a preliminary recommendation." He looked at Claire. "Sergeant Whitmore, there is a request at the command level for you to be considered for a training leadership position, specifically to develop and implement a new qualification assessment program for this outpost and potentially as a model for similar installations." The room absorbed this. It was the twist that nobody in that room, including Claire, had been expecting to arrive this quickly. The formal process for these things took weeks, sometimes months. The fact that it was being communicated, even as a preliminary indication within hours of the engagement, said something about the level of attention the day's events had generated above the level of Fort Raven Ridge. Claire did not react visibly, but her eyes moved to Reed's face with a sharpness that was different from her usual steady regard, a sharpness that was asking a question she had not voiced. Reed answered the unasked question. "I recommended it," he said, 2 hours ago, before the debrief started. A beat. "Before you apologize," she said. "Yes," he said. "The apology and the recommendation are separate things. The apology is personal. The recommendation is professional. Both are real. But I didn't want you to think one produced the other." Rodriguez made that almost imperceptible sound again. The contained agreement of a man who respected the distinction. Claire was quiet for a moment. "What would the program look like?" she said. It was the right question. Not what does this mean for me? Not why now or what took so long. What would the program look like? Because that was where her mind went immediately, directly toward the practical shape of the thing that could make the difference she had been thinking about for 7 months. Reed leaned forward slightly. "That would be largely up to you. The mandate I gave the base commander was specific. I told him the program needed to be built on ability, not assumptions. That every soldier's full record is reviewed and understood before any assignment is made. That there is a formal evaluation process for specialized skills that aren't visible in standard duty performance. He paused. I told him we built this problem over time by not looking. The fix has to be about learning to look. He was using her words, from the conditions she'd named at the start of the debrief. He had heard them, and he had taken them to the base commander, and he had built a case around them. The room felt it. Torres was writing steadily. Darden was looking at the table. Ethan, who had come back in during Reed's opening statement, was watching Claire with the quiet attention of someone who has been waiting for a particular moment and is now watching it arrive. I'll take the role, Claire said, not after a long deliberation, not with the performance of careful consideration. She had already known somewhere in the part of her that had been thinking about what this outpost needed since her second week, exactly what she would do if given the opportunity to fix the thing that had been broken. She had been preparing for this too, just not with a timeline. Reed nodded. Then for the first time in the debrief, he looked uncertain in the specific way that genuine uncertainty looks, not performed, not managed, but actually present. Whitmore, he said, I need to ask you something that isn't in any protocol. She waited. The soldiers who laughed, he said, in the briefing room. Some of them were good soldiers. Some of them will be in your training program. Some of them are going to be sitting across from you in a very different context than they were 3 days ago. He held her eyes. How do you intend to handle that? It was a real question, honest and specific. The question of a man trying to understand how the human mechanics of this were going to work. Not out of concern for the soldiers who had behaved badly, but out of a genuine attempt to understand the person he should have understood 7 months ago. Claire thought about it for a moment, not performing consideration, actually thinking. The same way I handle everything else, she said finally, by focusing on what they can become rather than what they demonstrated in a room 3 days ago. She paused. I don't want this program to be about proving a point. I don't want soldiers walking into my evaluations carrying shame about what happened. Shame doesn't make better soldiers. It makes soldiers who hide things. She looked around the room. I want them walking in carrying the understanding that capability is what matters, and that the evaluation exists to find it, not to punish the absence of it. Darden looked up from the table. Rodriguez, who had been leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed in the posture of a man who has been listening carefully for 2 hours, leaned forward. That's a better officer than most I've served under, Rodriguez said. Flat, direct, the way he said everything. And she's a sergeant. Reed looked at Rodriguez for a moment. Then he looked at Claire. Something passed across his face that was not quite an expression in any definable category. It was more like the visible movement of a conclusion arriving, settling, becoming fixed in the way that real conclusions do, the ones that don't get revised later. The formal promotion review process takes time, Reed said carefully. It does, Claire said, but it takes less time when the commanding officer drives it, he said. A beat, long enough to be deliberate. I intend to drive it, Reed said. Torres's pen moved steadily across the page. Ethan, for the first time in the entire debrief, allowed himself a small, controlled exhale, the kind that comes from the release of something held for a very long time. The debrief concluded at 21:17. People filed out in the gradual way of groups that have shared something significant and are not quite ready to re-enter the world that exists outside the room where it happened. Rodriguez stopped beside Claire on his way to the door. He didn't position himself for a formal exchange. He just stopped the way you stop next to someone when you have one specific thing to say and you want to say it without ceremony. Whitmore, he said. Rodriguez, she said. Chen's out of surgery, he said. His wife was notified. He's going to walk fine, full recovery. Something moved across Claire's face, brief and genuine and quickly contained. Good, she said. He asked me to tell you something, Rodriguez said. She waited. He said, and I'm quoting directly because these were his exact words when he came out of recovery. He said, tell Sergeant Whitmore that I'm going to be the best soldier she's ever trained. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she said, tell him I'm going to hold him to that. Rodriguez almost smiled. Not quite the full version of that expression was apparently reserved for occasions Rodriguez considered sufficiently extraordinary, and even today's events had not quite cleared that bar. But almost. He walked out. The room emptied until it was Claire and Ethan, which was where most significant moments in their working relationship had begun and ended the two of them in a room that other people had left processing what the day had been. "How do you feel?" Ethan said. This time she didn't deflect the question. "Tired," she said. "The good kind." He nodded. "It went further than you expected," he said. "The promotion, yes," she said. "The rest, no. The rest was always going to happen if the work was given the conditions to speak for itself." "You had faith in that," he said. "I had evidence," she said. "Faith is for things you can't demonstrate. I could demonstrate this. I just needed the situation." Ethan looked at her for a moment with the full honest attention he had always given her, the analytical gaze that saw clearly and without flattery or distortion. "7 months," he said. "7 months," and she confirmed. "Was it worth it?" She stood, picked up her copy of the debrief record, and looked at him with those steady eyes that had never, in all the time he had known her, looked anything other than exactly where they were. 22 soldiers came home, she said. She walked to the door. "Ethan," she said at the threshold, "you asked me 7 weeks ago why I let people underestimate me." "I remember," he said. "The real answer," she said, "is that I don't. I never did." She held his eyes across the room. "I just let them believe they did, until the moment it mattered, and then I let the truth answer for itself." She walked out. The corridor outside was quiet most of Fort Raven Ridge, settling into the late-night rhythm of a base that had been through a full-spectrum day and was exhaling into the dark on the other side of it. Claire walked through it with the same pace she always walked, steady, purposeful, exactly her own. Not faster, not slower, just herself, moving forward the way she had always moved forward toward the next thing that needed to be done. The next morning came the way mornings at Fort Raven Ridge always came cold early, indifferent to what the previous day had been. The altitude did not adjust for significance. The wind did not pause for aftermath. The mountains that surrounded the outpost had been there long before any of these people arrived, and would be there long after every one of them left, and they communicated this fact with the silent, absolute patience of things that have no need to make a point, because the point is simply true. Claire was up at 0500, not because she had to be. The new day's schedule did not require her until 0730. But 0500 was when she always rose, and the events of the previous 24 hours had not changed that. If anything, the discipline of the ordinary morning felt more necessary than usual, the anchor of routine in the wake of something extraordinary. The reassertion of the rhythms that had sustained her through 7 months of being unseen and one day of being seen so completely that the reversal was almost physical. She made coffee. She reviewed her notes from the debrief. She drafted the preliminary framework for the qualification program. Not formally, not in the official format that would be required eventually, but in the notebook she always carried in her own shorthand, the way she had always worked through problems alone early before the day arrived with its competing demands and social textures. The framework took shape over 40 minutes. It was built around a single principle that she wrote at the top of the first page and underlined: once capability is never self-evident, it must be actively sought. Everything else in the framework descended from that sentence: the evaluation structure, the records review process, the reassignment protocols, the feedback mechanisms, the training sequences. All of it rooted in the recognition that the system's failure at Fort Raven Ridge had not been a failure of individual character, though individual characters had failed, but a structural failure. A failure to build in the habit of looking, of asking, of refusing to let assumption substitute for evidence. She worked until 0615. Then she put the notebook away, finished her coffee, and went to the physical training ground. She ran alone the way she always ran. Steady pace, long distance. The kind of running that is not about performance, but about the maintenance of a body that might be required to do difficult things on short notice. She had been running this way since her first week at Fort Raven Ridge, before the light was fully up, before most of the base was moving in the solitude that had defined so much of her time here. The difference this morning was that she was not the only one on the training ground. Ortega was there. He was not running the same route. He was working through a strength circuit on the other side of the ground, the kind of training that requires discipline to maintain when nobody is watching. He saw her come onto the ground, and he straightened slightly, not to attention, not with formality, but with the particular alertness of someone acknowledging a presence that matters to them. She acknowledged him with a nod. He nodded back. They trained in parallels without speaking for 45 minutes. It was not a dramatic moment. Nobody watching would have identified it as significant. But it was the first morning at Fort Raven Ridge where Claire had not been entirely alone on that ground before the base woke up, and the small, unceremonious fact of Ortega being there, choosing to be there, rising early when he didn't have to, putting in the work that nobody required of him at this hour, registered in her chest as something quiet and real. The next person who arrived was Torres, then Darden. By 0650, there were 7 soldiers on the training ground before the official morning call. Nobody announced it. Nobody organized it. It was simply what happened when people who have witnessed something true spend the night with that truth and arrive the next morning slightly changed by it. Not transformed, change of the durable kind is never that fast, but shifted, oriented differently by a degree or two towards something they had been half turned away from without fully realizing it. Claire finished her run, came to a stop, and looked at the 7 people on the ground around her. She didn't say anything about it. She simply said good morning, the same way she said it every day, and went to cool down. But she noticed. She always noticed. The official program launch meeting was scheduled for 0900. Reed had moved quickly, more quickly than the formal institutional pace of these things usually permitted, which told Claire something about the level of support he had received from the base commander, and which told her something else about Reed himself. The speed was not bureaucratic efficiency. It was the speed of someone who has identified a wrong and is actively working against the friction of his own previous position to correct it. That kind of speed requires effort. Reed was putting in the effort. She arrived at the meeting room at 0855. Reed was already there. So was Darden. So was the base intelligence lead, a lieutenant colonel named Hargrove, who had been at the base commander's level of the briefing the night before, and whose presence today indicated that this program was being treated not as a Fort Raven Ridge initiative, but as something with potential reach beyond the outpost. When Claire came in, Hargrove stood up, not as a formal gesture, simply as the instinctive action of someone meeting someone for whom they have a specific and recently acquired respect. Sergeant Whitmore, Hargrove said. He was a compact man in his early 50s, precise in his movements, with the kind of measured vocal delivery that comes from years of briefing people who need accurate information quickly. I've read the full engagement report, and I've spent some time with your service file this morning. Yes, sir, Claire said. I want to be direct, Hargrove said. What happened at this outpost, the pattern of it, not just the incident, is not unique to Fort Raven Ridge. I've seen it at other installations. I've probably contributed to it at other installations, if I am being completely honest. He held her eyes. What you've built in that notebook, Reed sent me the preliminary framework last night, addresses the right things. I want to understand your full vision for it. This was the mini climax nobody had anticipated that morning. Not because it was confrontational, but because the weight of what Hargrove was saying, the acknowledgement of systemic failure by someone at his level, the implication that the program might extend far beyond what Claire had outlined in her 40 minutes of early morning note-taking shifted the entire scale of what the conversation was about. Claire felt it shift. She sat down, placed the notebook on the table, and opened it to the first page. The program starts with records, she said, not evaluations, records. Every soldier assigned to this outpost, and eventually every soldier assigned to any installation that adopts this framework, has their complete classified service file reviewed before duty assignments are made, not summarized. Reviewed it. She looked around the table. Because what happened here was not that someone failed to evaluate me. It was that someone decided they already knew what I was before they looked at any evidence. The first intervention has to be structural. You have to build a process that makes assumptions harder to act on. Hargrove was nodding slowly. Reed was listening with the focused stillness of someone who is not performing attention, but genuinely paying it. Then what? Hargrove said. Then you standardize the evaluation itself, Claire said. Not standard evaluation in the current sense. The current process is designed to identify deficiency. I want to redesign it to identify capability. The question shouldn't be, is this soldier adequate for this role? The question should be, what is this soldier actually capable of, and are we using that capability or wasting it? She paused. There are soldiers at this outpost right now who are in the wrong assignments, not because they failed anything, because nobody asked the right questions. Darden said, how many do you think? I don't have a number, Claire said, but I've been watching people here for 7 months. I have a list. She turned to the next page in the notebook. 12 names. Darden looked at the list. His expression didn't change externally, but something moved in his eyes that was recognizable to anyone who has ever experienced the specific discomfort of seeing evidence that you were right about the wrong thing. I know most of these soldiers, Darden said. Yes, Claire said. So do I. Some of them have been here longer than you, he said. Yes, she said. And you've been watching them for 7 months, he said. Yes, she said, a beat. How many of those 12, Darden said carefully, would you have identified in your first week if someone had shown you their full file? Claire looked at him. All of them, she said. The room sat with that. The meeting ran for 2 hours and 11 minutes. By the end of it, the framework had been expanded from Claire's notebook into a working document that Hargrove's team would formalize over the following weeks. The program had a name, the Capability Identification and Utilization Review, which would eventually be referred to simply as the CIU Review, which would eventually be referred to simply as the Whitmore Protocol, though that naming would happen later and would be proposed by people other than Claire. She would resist the name. She would lose that particular argument, but that was later. At 1100, the meeting concluded and the room began to empty. Reed held back. When it was just the two of them, he said, "There's one more thing I need to discuss with you." She waited. "Carver," he said. The name landed in the space between them with the specific gravity of unfinished business. Specialist David Carver, 26 years old, had spent the previous night in a state that his bunkmate would later describe as the quietest he had ever seen. Another person be not sleeping, not moving, simply lying in his bunk with his eyes open in the dark, which was the posture of someone who was inside an experience they had not yet found the language to process. He had been given the Overwatch assignment he was not ready for. He had been placed in a role that required exactly the preparation he had not done by a commanding officer who had chosen performance of confidence over evidence of capability, and he had stood on a ridge above Black Canyon Pass and been confronted with the full unmediated reality of that gap. He had frozen, and 22 people's lives had hung in the space created by that freeze. I was not a bad soldier. He was a soldier who had been failed by the system and then placed at the fulcrum of that failure's consequences. The distinction mattered, and it mattered most specifically to him, which was why he was currently lying in his bunk in the dark instead of sleeping. "What about Carver?" Claire said. Reed looked at her steadily. "He requested to speak with you. I told him I would ask." A pause. "He doesn't need my permission," she said. "No," Reed said, "but he believes he does, and I think you're the only person whose answer to that request is going to mean anything to him right now." Claire looked at Reed. "Send him," she said. Carver arrived at Claire's workspace at 1300 hours. He was not in the disheveled state of someone who had stopped caring. His uniform was correct, his bearing was maintained, and the effort required to maintain those things after a night like the one he'd had was visible not in sloppiness, but in a particular quality of controlled tension that the body carries when it is working very hard to hold itself together. He knocked on the open door. She looked up from the framework document. "Carver," she said. "Sergeant Whitmore," he said. He came in. He did not sit down until she indicated the chair across from her, and when he sat down, it was with the precise, careful posture of someone who is afraid that if they relax any part of their physical control, something else entirely might give way. "Say what you came to say," she said, not unkindly, simply directly, because in her assessment, which was always running what Carver needed, was not to be managed into comfort. He needed to be taken seriously. He looked at the table for a moment, then he looked at her. "I froze," he said. "Up there, I know what was happening. I understood the situation. I had my training, and I froze." He held her eyes because he had decided on his way here that he was going to look at her when he said this and not look away, because looking away would be one more version of not looking. 22 people were in that canyon. "Yes," she said. "And I couldn't do anything," he said, "and they came home because of you." A beat. "I need you to know that I understand the full weight of that, not as a fact I've been told, as something I understand." "I believe you," she said. He blinked. He had not expected the statement to come that quickly or that flatly. "You're not angry," he said. "I'm not," she said. He looked at her with something that was trying to be confusion, but was actually closer to the specific vertigo of having prepared at significant emotional cost for a confrontation that is not arriving. "I failed," he said. You were set up to fail, she said. That's not the same thing, and you need to understand the difference, because if you spend the next year carrying the weight of a system failure, as if it were a personal moral failure, you'll be carrying the wrong thing, and it will make you a worse soldier, not a better one. He was very still. You were not ready for that assignment, she said. That is true, but the person responsible for assigning you to a role you were not ready for is not you. The preparation gap was real. The assignment decision was wrong. Both of the things are true simultaneously. She looked at him steadily. What you are responsible for is what comes next. What you do with what you know now about that gap. A long silence. I want to close it, he said. Then close it, she said. I don't know where to start, he said. I do, she said, because closing preparation gaps is what I'm going to be doing for the next several months, and you're on my list. She watched his face. Not as a problem to fix, as a soldier with specific capabilities that weren't properly developed. There's a difference. Carver looked at her for a full 3 seconds. And then something in him, the rigid, effortful hold of someone who has been bracing against a weight all night, shifted. Not collapsed, not broke. Shifted the way a load redistributes when the person carrying it finds a better grip. His shoulders came down by about half an inch. His jaw released slightly. Why are you doing this? He said. And there was something raw in the question that he hadn't intended to expose, but that came out anyway, because the question was real, and real questions find their way out regardless of intention. After what? After how you were treated. Why does any of this matter to you? Claire looked at him for a moment. Because you are going to be someone's Overwatch someday, she said, and I want that person to come home. Carver said nothing, because there was nothing to say. He nodded once slowly with the weight of someone receiving something they will carry for a long time, and he stood and he left. Claire watched him go. Then she went back to the framework document. The days that followed moved with the particular rhythm of a place that has been through something that cannot be returned from, and is now building the new version of itself on the other side. It was not smooth. Real change never is. There were conversations that were uncomfortable, evaluations that surfaced things people would have preferred remained unsurfaced, assignments that were restructured in ways that required soldiers to acknowledge they had been in the wrong positions, which required them to acknowledge things about the system that had placed them there, which required them to acknowledge their own role in maintaining that system. None of it was simple. All of it was necessary. In the third week, Claire conducted the first formal evaluation sessions under the new framework. She designed them not as tests, but as conversations, structured, documented skills-based conversations that asked soldiers to demonstrate what they could do rather than describe what they had done. She sat across from soldiers who had laughed at her name in a briefing room, and she evaluated them with the same clear, evidence-based precision she brought to everything, without score settling, without condescension, without any trace of the score she could have run if she had chosen to. Some of them were more capable than their current assignments suggested. Some of them were in exactly the right roles. Some of them had gaps that needed work, and she documented those gaps the same way she documented capabilities. Specifically, honestly, without dramatizing the deficiency or minimizing it. Sergeant First Class Darden sat in on the first 3 evaluation sessions as an observer. After the third one, he came to her workspace and said, I've been doing performance evaluations at this level for 11 years. She waited. That was better than anything I've done, he said. Not because you're smarter, because you're asking different questions. He paused. Where did you learn to do that? She looked at him. From being on the wrong side of the wrong questions for a long time, she said. Darden nodded once with the expression of someone who has just heard a sentence that is going to stay with them. He left. The twist that nobody saw coming arrived in week 4. A request came in from a different installation, forward operating support base. Kellerman, located at a different elevation point in the same mountain region, asking to send 3 of their senior NCOs to observe the new evaluation process at Fort Raven Ridge. The request had come through official channels. It had Hargrove's mark on it. It had clearly been discussed at levels above Fort Raven Ridge's immediate command structure. Reed brought it to Claire directly. Kellerman wants to observe, he said, with the intention of potentially adapting the framework for their own use. Claire read the request document. How did Kellerman hear about this? She said. Reed looked at her steadily. I told them. a beat. You initiated outreach to another installation, she said. Yes, he said. How many installations, she said. Reed put a second document on the table. She looked at it. 4 installations, all within the mountain operations region, all receiving the preliminary framework document, all expressing interest in observation or adaptation. Claire looked at the document for a long moment. You did this without telling me, she said. I did, he said, because I didn't want the decision about scale to feel like pressure. I wanted you to build the program the right way first and let the reach follow from the work. She looked at him. This was the moment, one of the moments, because there had been several over the past 4 weeks where she was required to recalibrate her understanding of Mason Reed. Not rehabilitate him, not forgive and forget in the way that erases history, but genuinely revise based on evidence what she understood about who he was now versus who he had been. He had done the reading, he had made the calls, he had moved on the problem with the specific urgency of someone who has decided that urgency is what the situation deserves and is not going to let institutional friction slow it down. It was the same principle she operated by, applied finally by the person who had once looked at her name on a board and laughed. 4 installations, she said. To start, he said. She looked back at the document. I'll need more time to adapt the evaluation framework for different operational contexts, she said. Each installation has different terrain, different mission profiles, different. I know, he said. You'll have it. Take what you need. She looked at him. Reed, she said. And it was the first time she had used his name without a rank, which was not a moment either of them acknowledged out loud, but which both of them registered. Whitmore, he said. 3 days ago you told the room I wasn't your problem, she said. Not with anger, with the factual precision of someone documenting a reference point. 4 weeks later, you're expanding the program to 4 installations. Yes, he said. What changed, she said. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the table, then at the documents between them, then at her. I read a file, he said. 7 months too late. A silence. But I read it, he said. Claire held his eyes. Then she picked up the 4 installation document and said, I'll need to visit Kellerman in person before I adapt anything for them, and I need to see the terrain, understand the culture. I'll arrange it, he said. Next week, she said. Done, he said, and she stood. One more thing, she said. Go ahead, he said. The 12 soldiers on the list from the framework meeting, she said. I've completed initial evaluations on 9 of them. 7 need assignment changes. I want to present the recommendations formally with full documentation by end of week. Reed nodded. I'll convene the panel. One of the 7, she said, is Carver. Reed's expression shifted. Carver's reassignment, he said. He has a specific aptitude for terrain analysis and long-range assessment that was never identified in his current assignment profile, she said. With the right training program, structured correctly, he could eventually qualify for Overwatch. Reed looked at her for a long moment. You're going to train him, he said. I'm going to give him the preparation he should have had before anyone put him on that ridge, she said. What he does with it is his decision. Reed was quiet. Then quietly, you could have made him an example of the failure. You're making him an example of the fix. Yes, she said. White-eyed, he said. Genuinely. Because that's what the program is, she said. If I only use it to vindicate myself, it's not a program. It's a revenge. And revenge doesn't build anything. She left. Behind her, Reed stood at the table with the 4 installation document in his hand, looking at the doorway through which she had walked, with the expression of someone watching an idea become architecture, watching the abstract principle of what should be done transform one decision at a time into the actual structure of what is being built. He had been a good officer before this. He understood that now in a different way than he had understood it 3 weeks ago. I had been competent. He had been effective. He had made decisions that held up under scrutiny, but he had also carried the specific blindness of someone who confused the confidence of his own judgment with the accuracy of it, who mistook the absence of challenge for the presence of correctness, who had surrounded himself with enough success that the failures he was creating, the quiet ones, the invisible ones, the ones that walked into his outpost and completed every task without complaint and were never asked what else they could do, had never surfaced as failures at all. They had just surfaced as background, as given, as the way things were. He had learned the difference this week between the way things were and the way things had to be. He was still learning it. Ethan found Claire that evening in the communications section, not because she was on duty there, but because she had come back to it the way people come back to the places that hold the shape of a significant period in their lives. She was sitting at the station she had occupied for 7 months, not working, just sitting, which was itself unusual enough that he registered it before he registered anything else. He sat down across from her. Big week, he said. She said. 4 installations, he said. Reed told you. Reed told everyone, he said. He's moving on this faster than I've seen him move on anything. He's good at execution when he's committed, she said. That was always true. The commitment was the problem. Ethan nodded. And now he's committed. Now he's committed, she said, a comfortable silence. You're going to leave, Ethan said. It was not a question. It landed in the conversation with the specific weight of something that has been known for a while and is now being named. Claire looked at him. Eventually, she said, not immediately, but the program doesn't stay at Fort Raven Ridge. That was never the point. The point is the program going where it's needed, and eventually I go with it. To Kellerman first, he said. To Kellerman first, she confirmed, then wherever it needs to go. Ethan absorbed this. And Fort Raven Ridge, he said. Fort Raven Ridge doesn't need me anymore, she said, in the best possible way. A pause. Darden can run the evaluation program. He's been watching closely enough to carry it. Ortega is going to be exactly what you'd want him to be in 3 years if someone gives him the right guidance. Torres has more capability than his current role reflects. That's in my list. She looked around the communications section with the steady, unhurried regard of someone taking account of something they have cared about. This place is better than it was. That's what the work was for. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. 7 months, he said. You came here and spent 7 months being invisible, doing work nobody saw, being dismissed by the person in charge, and you built all of this. The work built it, she said. I just did the work. Claire, he said. She looked at him. You know that's not... He stopped, tried again. You know that most people would have left, or fought, or demanded to be seen in a way that made a scene instead of making a difference. Most people, she said. Why didn't you, he said. She was quiet for a moment, not because the answer wasn't there, because she was deciding how much of the answer to give and settling on all of it because Ethan had earned all of it. Because the soldiers here are real, she said. I said that to you before, but the deeper answer is I've been in places where the culture was wrong and nobody stayed to change it. Everyone who saw it leaving because the seeing was uncomfortable and the culture stayed wrong. She held his eyes. I decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to be someone who only works in the places that are already right, because those places don't need the work as much. Ethan looked at her with the full, honest weight of 7 weeks of friendship and 1 day of being beside her on a ridge above a canyon where 26 targets had stood between the truth and 22 soldiers going home. Fort Raven Ridge is lucky, he said. Fort Raven Ridge didn't know it, she said. But yes, he nodded. When Kellerman, he said. Next week, she said. Reed's arranging transport. I'd like to come, he said. She looked at him. As spotter, he said. Something moved across her face, brief, real, and unmistakably warm. The full version of the expression she usually kept contained, arriving without performance because there was nobody watching except Ethan, and Ethan had already seen everything. As spotter, she said. She stood. She picked up the notebook, the same one she had carried every day for 7 months, that had held observations and frameworks and preparations that nobody had asked to see, and she held it for a moment. Then she put it in her pocket, the left breast pocket, where it had always been. She walked out of the communications section for what both of them understood without saying was the last time she would walk out of it as the person assigned there. The next time she walked in, it would be as something else, as someone building what came after the 7 months of silence. The corridor was quiet. Fort Raven Ridge was settling into its night rhythm. Somewhere at the medical facility, Specialist Marcus Chen was sleeping without pain medication for the first time since Black Canyon Pass, which his attending physician had noted in his chart as a significant recovery milestone. Somewhere in his quarters, Captain Mason Reed was reading a file, not Claire's this time, but the first of the 12 names on her list, working through the documents with the margin writing focus he had now made a habit, beginning the slow and necessary work of actually knowing the people he commanded. somewhere at a different installation. 3 senior NCOs from Kellerman had received the preliminary framework document and were marking it up with questions for their site visit next week because the document had arrived with a reputation attached to it that made them want to prepare. And in the corridor of Fort Raven Ridge, Claire Whitmore walked through the night she had always walked through, carrying the notebook she had always carried, moving toward the work she had always been built to do. Not faster, not slower, exactly herself. The battlefield had not discovered her. It had never needed to discover her. She had always been there in the early mornings, in the late nights, in the 7 months of invisibility. In the one day when the truth arrived the way it always arrives for people who have done the real work. Not announced, not awarded, simply inevitable. 26 targets, 1 soldier. One unforgettable truth that did not begin on that ridge and did not end when the last position went silent, because the truth was never about the 26, and it was never about a single day, and it was never about being seen. It was about being ready. And Claire Whitmore had been ready since the very first morning she arrived at Fort Raven Ridge, and quietly, without announcement, without audience, without anyone watching at all,